Welcome back, everyone. Really excited to dive into today's explainer. We're tackling a massive topic, one of the absolute most talked about geopolitical flashpoints on the planet. We're doing a deep, strictly analytical dive into the military power of the United States versus Iran, specifically projecting out to the year 2026. Tensions have been running incredibly high lately, right? A military confrontation always feels like it's just looming on the horizon. But hey, instead of just wildly guessing what might happen, we are going to let the data do the talking. We're putting the ultimate global superpower right up against a highly determined, deeply entrenched Middle Eastern heavyweight. So, let's kick things off with the big question, the one that really defines this entire rivalry. Can guerrilla tactics actually survive against a global superpower? Today, we are going way beyond just counting up tanks and planes. We really want to understand the clash here. Overwhelming conventional might on one side, facing off against a highly calculated asymmetric strategy on the other. To figure that out, we've broken this explainer down into 5 key domains: the defense budget gap, air power and defenses, carriers versus naval swarms, missiles and drone warfare, and finally, ground forces and geography. All right, let's get right into domain number 1, the defense budget gap. Because let's face it, any military comparison absolutely has to start with the financial foundation. The very first thing you've got to grasp here is the sheer, mind-boggling scale of the spending difference. The U.S. defense budget, it sits at a staggering $895 billion. I mean, that is literally enough money to swallow the entire economies of several nations whole. It pays for brand new weapons, top-tier training, the upkeep of over 800 military bases worldwide, and the absolute most cutting-edge tech. Meanwhile, Iran's defense budget is minuscule by comparison, hovering right around $15 to $20 billion, largely because they've been heavily constrained by decades of severe international sanctions. So, what does this actually mean in practice? Well, it's all about how they spend that money. The U.S. is paying for global power projection, basically the ability to fight anywhere on Earth at any given time. Iran, on the flip side, takes its highly limited budget and focuses entirely on regional defense and asymmetric warfare. You see, they don't want to fight across the globe, they just want to defend their own neighborhood. And they pull this off by mastering cheap yet incredibly effective technologies, stuff that's specifically designed to inflict maximum damage at the absolute minimum cost. Moving right along to Section 2, air power and defenses. And wow, the gap here is literally as vast as the sky itself. Check this out. The United States boasts the largest, most modern air force on the planet. We're talking over 13,000 military aircraft, completely stacked with 5th-generation stealth fighters and strategic bombers. In stark contrast, Iran has roughly 551 aircraft. Those sanctions we just mentioned, they mean Iran simply hasn't been able to modernize, so they're left relying heavily on pre-1979 relics, like old F-14s and MiG-29s. Look, in a straight-up, direct dogfight, it's honestly no contest whatsoever. But this brilliantly illustrates exactly how Iran had to adapt. They know perfectly well their aging jets cannot go toe-to-toe with American stealth fighters, right? So, instead of trying to win up in the sky, they focused everything on the ground. For decades, Iran has been building a massive, incredibly dense web of ground-to-air missile systems. Their entire goal isn't to outfly the U.S., it's to deny American jets easy access to their airspace, essentially throwing up this highly dangerous, impenetrable shield over their territory. Okay, let's bring it down to the oceans for Section 3, carriers versus naval swarms. Honestly, this oceanic strategy perfectly captures the whole David versus Goliath dynamic of this rivalry. The U.S. operates what we call a true blue water navy. That means they completely command the deep open oceans globally. And the absolute cornerstone of this power, 11 massive aircraft carriers. Just one of these ships is basically a floating city, a mobile airbase housing 70 to 80 fighter jets. Add to that 81 destroyers and 70 nuclear submarines that can stay underwater for months on end. Now, Iran, they don't have a single aircraft carrier. Instead, they rely on that asymmetric strategy again, deploying thousands of highly maneuverable, ultra-fast speedboats packed with machine guns and missiles, operating right alongside Kilo-class diesel-electric submarines that are custom-built for shallow waters. Now, you might be wondering, why does this specific matchup matter? Well, it's all about geography. Iran's strategy isn't to sail out and meet the U.S. Navy in the middle of the open Pacific Ocean. No way. Their strategy is tailor-made for narrow choke points, specifically the Strait of Hormuz. In these tight, shallow waters, those massive American destroyers and carriers suddenly become a lot more vulnerable to thousands of small, heavily armed Iranian swarm boats attacking from all sides at once. It's the ultimate naval guerrilla warfare. And get this, because roughly 20% of the entire world's oil flows right through this one strait, any clash here would instantly cause global energy prices to absolutely skyrocket. That perfectly sets up our fourth domain. And frankly, this right here is Iran's absolute strongest area: missiles and drone warfare. Remember how we said Iran's air force is outdated? Well, to make up for it, they poured a massive amount of their resources into building the Middle East's largest ballistic missile stockpile. According to Pentagon reports, we're looking at an estimated 3,000-plus ballistic missiles. This includes heavy hitters like the Shahab-3 and the Khorramshahr, which boast ranges of up to 2,000 kilometers. That means they can effortlessly strike U.S. bases all across the region and even reach Israel. But that's not all. Alongside the missiles, Iran has seriously emerged as a drone superpower, making headlines with their Shahed 136 kamikaze drones. These things are incredibly cheap to churn out, yet they are remarkably adept at evading radar and landing precise, devastating strikes. The underlying strategy here is just fascinating. The U.S. undeniably has the best, most advanced missile defense systems in the world, period. But Iran's logic leans entirely on sheer volume. The whole idea behind the swarm strategy is that if you fire thousands of cheap drones and missiles simultaneously, you can literally overload, exhaust, and eventually break through even the most sophisticated multi-billion-dollar defense grids on the planet. So, what happens if push comes to shove and boots actually hit the ground? Let's pivot to our fifth domain, ground forces and geography. And honestly, you might be surprised to hear that the numbers here are a whole lot closer than they are in the air or out at sea. When looking at the ground game, the U.S. fields roughly 1.3 million active duty troops. They're decked out with the absolute best armor and communications gear money can buy, backed up by about 4,600 state-of-the-art M1 Abrams tanks. Plus, you can't ignore the fact that U.S. forces have decades of highly integrated combat experience from conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Iran, on the other hand, fields about 610,000 active troops and relies on much older tank models. But here is the massive catch. Iran has the ability to rapidly mobilize millions of additional fighters through their civilian Basij militia, and that's working right alongside their highly formidable elite forces, the IRGC. But wait, Iran's absolute greatest defensive asset on the ground isn't actually its manpower, it's the geography. It is rugged, unforgiving, and incredibly vast. We're talking a terrain utterly dominated by towering mountain ranges and scorching, harsh deserts. For the Iranian defenders, who naturally know every single inch of this environment, the very landscape itself acts as this immense natural fortress. Military analysts hit the nail on the head when summarizing this reality. Many have pointed out that any U.S. ground invasion would face brutal, nightmarish conditions, quoting that it would make an advance as difficult as Vietnam or Afghanistan. The terrain alone essentially guarantees that a ground war would quickly devolve into a protracted, grinding guerrilla resistance, which completely negates a whole lot of America's flashy technological advantages. All right, that brings us to Section 6, Conventional versus Asymmetric Warfare. We've spent time looking at all the hardware and the numbers, so what is the ultimate core strategic takeaway from all of this? It really all boils down to this fundamental contrast. If these two nations were to fight a purely conventional war, just lining up out in the open, the USA's overwhelming budget and bleeding-edge tech would result in the rapid, absolute destruction of Iranian forces. The US could probably wipe out Iran's traditional Navy and Air Force in a matter of days. But here's the thing, Iran knows this. They know it perfectly well. Therefore, their entire military apparatus is designed from the ground up for one singular goal: to ensure that any conflict becomes a prolonged, endlessly bloody, and financially unacceptable war of attrition. Through thousands of missiles, cheap drone swarms, massive proxy networks, and treacherous terrain, Iran is built to make a victory simply too painful and too costly for the U.S. to ever truly pursue. Which leaves us with this final, genuinely provocative thought to chew on. The data clearly shows us a blueprint for a grueling, bitter stalemate. But as we all know, in the real world, no conflict ever happens in a vacuum. In a prolonged, devastating war of attrition, would Iran's asymmetrical defenses really hold out indefinitely? Or would major global allies inevitably step in, suddenly turning a bilateral conflict into something much, much larger? Well, I want to thank you all so much for joining me for today's explainer. Keep questioning the data, keep looking right past the surface, and I will see you next time.